Imagine standing on the biggest stage of your career, finally seen by your parents, only to have your own brother steal your life's work 2 days later. This isn't a story about forgiveness. It's a story about what happens when a quiet woman chooses to reclaim her name. The lights in the grand ballroom of the Seattle Waterfront Center hit me like 1,000 tiny accusations that night. I stood on the stage, heart hammering against my ribs, clutching the heavy crystal award for Designer of the Decade. My hands were shaking so badly I was afraid I might drop it. Below me, hundreds of faces blurred together under the warm glow of the chandeliers. But two faces stood out clear as daylight: Harlan Quill and Lenore Quill, my parents. For the first time in my entire career, they had shown up. My father sat straighter than I'd ever seen him, his silver hair catching the light. My mother's eyes glistened with something I had waited my whole life to see: real, unguarded pride. Echo House, the presenter announced. A groundbreaking sustainable residence that doesn't just respect the environment, it listens to it. 3 years. 3 brutal, beautiful years of sleepless nights, rejected prototypes, and moments I almost gave up. All of it had led to this single shining minute. I smiled, but inside I felt something fragile and dangerous bloom in my chest. Hope. Dangerous hope. Thank you, I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I felt. This project taught me that a home isn't just walls and glass, it's memory and possibility. The applause rolled over me like warm water. My mother actually clapped hardest, her hands rising above her head. My father gave me a small, rare nod. For one perfect moment, I let myself believe the years of quiet distance between us had finally begun to close. 48 hours later, that belief shattered. I was alone in my studio at 11:17 p.m., still riding the high, sketching minor tweaks to the Echo House model when the glass door burst open. Talia Reed stormed in, her coat half off, eyes wide with panic. "Vesper," she gasped, voice cracking. "It's bad, it's really, really bad." She slammed her laptop onto my work table and spun it toward me. There, on the homepage of the biggest design publication in the country, was my project. My soul. My Echo House. Only it wasn't mine anymore. The headline screamed, "Kairos Quill unveils revolutionary eco-residence, Horizon's new star." Every line, every angle, every sustainable system I had painstakingly developed over 3 years was there. Word for word, file for file. Even the small handwritten notes I'd left in the margins had been copied. Talia's voice trembled as she spoke. "He sold the complete original files to Apex Designs 2 days ago. They're already claiming you copied them. The entire industry is turning on you. Contracts are being frozen. Your biggest client just pulled the $8 million deal. The bank has already flagged your studio accounts." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. My brother's face smiled back at me from the article. Confident, charming, the golden boy once again. The same smile he wore when our parents praised his creativity. A cold wave crashed over me. Not anger yet. Something heavier. Something that felt like drowning. I thought of my mother clapping on that stage. My father's proud nod. The way they had finally looked at me like I mattered. All of it gone. In one night, my name, Vesper Quill, went from being celebrated to being whispered as a thief. I sank into my chair, the crystal award still sitting on the corner of my desk like a cruel joke. My fingers traced the engraved letters of my name. They didn't just steal my work. They stole the only thing I had ever truly built for myself. The silence in the studio was deafening. Outside, Seattle rain tapped softly against the tall windows, indifferent to the wreckage inside. Talia stood frozen, waiting for me to scream, to cry, to call the lawyers. But I didn't. I simply closed the laptop with a soft click. My voice, when it finally came, was quiet, calm in a way that scared even me. "They didn't just take my ideas, Talia. They took the name I spent my whole life earning." I looked up at her, eyes burning but dry. But that night, I made a promise to myself. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle deep in my bones. One day, that same name, my name, will be the thing that saves them. My lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. And it will also be the thing that ends them. The rain kept falling, and in that quiet, rain-soaked studio, something inside me shifted forever. This is not just a story about betrayal. It's a story about what happens when a woman decides that her name, her work, and her worth will never again be taken from her without consequence. And how sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't loud, it's patient. I left Seattle without saying goodbye to anyone, Not to the colleagues who once toasted me at the gala, not to the clients who had suddenly gone silent, and certainly not to my family. 2 weeks after that night in the studio, I packed what little dignity I had left into a small moving truck. Jude Ashford drove while I sat in the passenger seat with our 4-year-old daughter Lyra sleeping against my shoulder. The rain that had fallen the night everything collapsed seemed to follow us all the way to the quiet outskirts of Portland. I didn't cry during the drive, I was too empty for tears. We found a modest house with a converted barn in the back that became my new studio. The walls were old wood and the light came in soft and forgiving through dusty windows. Nothing like the sleek glass space I had lost. But it was mine. No one could take it from me. Elias Crow found me there 3 months later. The legendary mentor, a man who had shaped half the great sustainable designers of the last 20 years, simply showed up one afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee and a quiet understanding in his eyes. He never asked for the full story. He only said, "Sometimes the fire that burns your house down is the same fire that clears the land for something truer." With his gentle guidance, I started over. Small projects at first. A tiny cabin for a retired teacher. A community garden pavilion that cost almost nothing, but gave children a place to dream. I poured every ounce of pain into those modest walls, designing with an honesty I had never allowed myself before. No flash, no performance, just truth. Jude was my anchor. He never pushed me to talk about what happened in Seattle. He simply came home every evening, kissed my forehead, and asked what I needed for the next day. Some nights I would wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, the image of my mother's proud clapping still burning behind my eyes. Jude would pull me close without a word until the shaking stopped. Lyra, bless her innocent heart, became my unexpected light. At 4 years old, she didn't understand why Mommy worked so much or why we left the big city. She only knew that the new studio smelled like fresh cedar and that I let her paint little birds on the model pieces. 5 years passed like that, slow, deliberate, and heavy with things I never spoke aloud. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, while waiting for coffee at the local cafe, I saw it. A glossy design magazine lying on the counter. On the cover, smiling confidently under bold letters, Kairos Quill, the new voice of sustainable luxury. My breath caught. There it was. My Echo House. Rebranded as Horizon Nest. Every elegant curve, every smart ventilation system, every detail I had bled for, now wearing my brother's name like a crown. The article praised his bold vision and innovative spirit. I stood there frozen, the paper cup burning my palm. Further down the page was a photograph of my parents at a charity gala. Harlan Quill with his arm around Kairos, Lenore Quill beaming beside them, telling the reporter how proud they were of their son's breakthrough success. Something inside my chest twisted so sharply I had to set the magazine down. Talia Reid had stayed behind in Seattle like a quiet guardian. Every few months she sent me encrypted emails, short, factual updates. She never sugarcoated anything. She simply told me the truth. How deeply the industry had accepted Kairos's version, how my name had slowly faded into a cautionary whisper. And then there was Lila Sterling. The sharp-tongued sustainability influencer stumbled across the real story through Talia. One rainy afternoon, she drove all the way to my barn studio unannounced, carrying a bottle of wine and an anger that matched my own. She listened without interrupting, as I finally spoke some of the poison I had carried for years. Then she looked at me and said softly, "Your silence is powerful, Vesper. But one day you might choose to speak. Not for revenge, but so other women don't have to disappear the way you almost did." Her words stayed with me longer than I expected. She began featuring my small projects on her platform, not as tragedy, but as quiet strength. Messages started coming in from young female designers who felt seen for the first time. Slowly, painfully, my pain began transforming into something that could help others. Yet every night when the house grew still and Lyra was asleep, the old wound still throbbed. I never filed a lawsuit. I never posted a single accusation. I simply disappeared and rebuilt. One cold autumn evening, 5 years after that devastating night, I stood alone in my studio. The lights were low. Rain tapped gently on the metal roof. In my hands, I held the original small-scale model of Echo House, the one I had kept hidden like a scar. My fingers traced the tiny sustainable louvers I had designed with such care. I brought the model close to my chest and whispered into the quiet. I don't need them to admit what they did. My voice was steady, almost gentle. I just need them to feel exactly what they made me feel. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a long, patient sigh. And somewhere deep inside me, the silent inferno continued to burn. Controlled, focused, and waiting. This is a story about choosing silence when the world expects you to scream. It's about protecting your fire long enough to let it forge something stronger than the hands that tried to destroy it. The call came at 2:14 a.m. I was half awake on the couch, a half-finished sketch still clutched in my hand, when my phone lit up with Talia Reed's name. I answered before the second ring, heart already tightening. "Vesper," Talia whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to hear this." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Kairos's biggest project yet, the Horizon Tower, the one built on the stolen bones of Echo House, was failing. A critical structural flaw in the ventilation system had emerged during final testing. The same flaw I had caught and corrected 5 years ago in my original designs. The error was catastrophic. If it wasn't fixed within 72 hours, the entire tower risked collapse under its own weight. Marcus Lang, the reclusive billionaire developer everyone in the industry fought to work with, had given them one last chance. He wanted the best person alive to save the project. No questions asked, no explanations needed. And Talia had quietly made sure his team knew only one name could solve it in time. Mine. I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain against the barn roof, feeling the old wound rip open again. 5 years of silence. 5 years of rebuilding a quieter life. 5 years of teaching myself not to look back. And now the door I had sealed shut was cracking open on its own. The next morning I drove to Elias Crow's small cabin overlooking the river. He was sitting on the porch as if he had been expecting me. I told him everything Talia had said. When I finished, he studied me for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "This isn't a gift from the universe, Vesper," he said quietly, "and it's not your moment for revenge." He leaned forward, eyes steady. "This is the moment you decide who you really are." His words settled deep in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that after everything they had taken from me, I deserved this chance to watch them burn. But something in his calm voice made the anger feel suddenly childish. Still, I booked the flight. Seattle greeted me with the same gray drizzle I remembered. I rented a car and drove straight to the sleek glass tower that housed the project offices. The same building where my old studio used to be, just a few floors higher now. I stood outside the main entrance for nearly 10 minutes, unable to step forward. My reflection stared back at me from the polished glass doors. Older, quieter, stronger. But beneath the surface, the scared young designer who had once lost everything was still there, trembling. What if they recognized me immediately? What if my parents were inside? What if Kairos looked me in the eye and smiled that same charming smile? I adjusted the collar of my coat, took a slow breath, and walked in. No one knew who I was. Marcus Lang's team had arranged everything under a neutral consultant name. I moved through security, took the private elevator, and stepped into the top-floor war room where panic hung thick in the air. Blueprints covered every surface. Engineers argued in hushed, desperate voices. And there, standing at the center of it all with his back to me, was my brother. Kairos Quill looked exhausted. His usual confidence had cracks in it now. His hair was slightly disheveled, sleeves rolled up, staring at the failing schematics, like they had personally betrayed him. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and nausea twist inside me. Before anyone could speak, Marcus Lang entered from the side door. Tall, silver-haired, and radiating the quiet power that came from never needing to raise his voice. His eyes found mine immediately. "Ms. Quill," he said, using my real name for the first time, "you're the only one who can fix this. We both know it." A few heads turned, including Kairos's. The moment his eyes met mine, the color drained from his face. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I held his gaze without blinking. In that single heartbeat, 5 years of silence collapsed between us. All the nights I had cried alone, all the mornings I had forced myself to keep creating, all the times I had watched my daughter laugh and wondered what kind of mother I would have been if they hadn't tried to erase me. I turned to Marcus Lang and spoke with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "I'll need complete access to every file, no restrictions, and my name goes on every correction I make. Publicly. Lang nodded once. Done. As the team slowly realized what was happening, I felt the weight of their stares. But I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at Kairos again. Not yet. Later that evening, after the initial assessments, I stood alone in the quiet hallway outside the war room. The city lights of Seattle sparkled far below through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over my brother's number. A number I had deleted years ago but still remembered by heart. The old fear rose up, the old hurt. The memory of my mother's proud clapping at the gala, now poisoned forever. I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them again. My voice, when I finally spoke into the empty hallway, was low and ice-cold. They just opened the door they slammed in my face 5 years ago. I paused, letting the words settle deep inside my bones. And this time, I'm walking through it. The rain continued to fall against the glass, soft and relentless. And for the first time in 5 years, I felt the silent inferno inside me begin to move. This is a story about the terrifying power of second chances, not for those who hurt you, but for the person you choose to become when the moment finally arrives. I stepped into the glass tower just after dawn on the second day. The horizon tower rose around me like a monument to stolen dreams, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces that threw my own face back at me in fragments. Marcus Lang had cleared the path. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. I moved through the sleek lobby and up the private elevator wearing the same calm expression I had practiced in the hotel mirror that morning. But inside, my stomach was a knot of old fear and something sharper. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, the war room fell into a heavy silence. Kairos Quill stood at the head of the long table, surrounded by anxious engineers and executives. The moment his eyes landed on me, the color drained from his face. His hand froze mid-gesture over the digital blueprints. He knew. Harlan and Lenore Quill were there too, seated near the back as silent observers. My father's posture stiffened instantly. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, a small broken sound escaping before she could stop it. "Vesper?" Lenore whispered, her voice cracking across the room like thin ice. I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. Instead, I turned to Marcus Lang, who waited at the far end of the table with quiet authority. "I'm here to fix it," I said evenly. "But I have one condition. Every correction, every decision, every revised drawing will carry my name, Vesper Quill, publicly and permanently." Lang studied me for a long second, then gave a single nod. Agreed. The next 48 hours became a blur of fluorescent lights, endless coffee, and whispered calculations. I worked without sleep, moving from screen to screen, pointing out the fatal flaw Kairos had overlooked, the same flaw I had caught and elegantly solved 5 years earlier in Echo House. My hands moved with cold precision, while my mind kept drifting to memories I wished I could bury. The sound of my mother's proud applause at the gala, the way my father had finally looked at me with something like respect. Now they watched me from the edges of the room like strangers. Talia Reed and Lila Sterling worked silently from outside the tower. Talia fed me precise data through encrypted messages. Lila gathered quiet statements from former colleagues who had witnessed the original theft. They built an invisible wall of truth around me, collecting evidence that could never be erased again. In the quiet hallway during a brief break on the second night, Lenore found me. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she reached for my arm. "Vesper, please," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't know. I never wanted any of this. We were wrong, so wrong. Can't you forgive us? We're still your family." I felt the old ache rise up, sharp and familiar. For a moment I almost softened. Almost. I gently pulled my arm away. "This isn't about forgiveness right now, Mother," I said softly. "This is about saving a building that should never have been built on lies." Harlan appeared behind her, his face tight with the old authority I remembered so well. "Vesper, enough of this," he said, voice low and commanding. "You're still my daughter. Blood is thicker than any mistake. Let's handle this as a family and put the past behind us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me finally settle. "No, Father," I replied, my voice steady. "You don't get to decide when the past matters and when it doesn't." I turned and walked back into the war room without another word. The tension in the air grew thicker with every passing hour. Then, on the morning of the third day, Marcus Lang called an emergency press conference right there in the tower lobby. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward. Kairos stood off to the side, pale and silent, his usual charm nowhere to be found. Lang stepped to the microphone, calm and commanding. This project was on the brink of catastrophic failure, he said. It only survived because of one person, the woman who identified and corrected the critical errors in record time. Without her expertise and integrity, Horizon Tower would not be standing today. He paused, letting the weight settle. I present to you the true mind behind the rescue, Vesper Quill. The room erupted in murmurs and flashing lights. Kairos stood frozen, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. In that moment, I watched the truth crash over him. He could not exist in this industry without the talent he had tried to steal from his own sister. I met his eyes across the crowded lobby, but I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply let him feel the full weight of what he had done. Later that night, the rain returned, heavy and cleansing. I walked out of the glass tower alone, my coat pulled tight against the downpour. My footsteps echoed on the wet pavement. Behind me, I left a thick sealed folder on Marcus Lang's desk. Inside were years of documentation, original timestamps, and irrefutable proof of what had been stolen that night 5 years ago. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, not to my brother who had finally been forced to see me clearly, not to my parents who stood watching from the upper windows like ghosts. I simply stepped into the rain and kept walking. This is a story about the quiet power of refusing to shrink yourself for people who once tried to erase you. It's about standing tall when the moment comes, not for their redemption, but for your own. 6 months later, the rain in Seattle tasted different. It fell softer against the tall windows of the new studio, almost like it was finally offering forgiveness to the city below. I stood in the center of the bright, open space we had named Quill and Ashford Collective, watching late afternoon light spill across the reclaimed wood floors. The scent of fresh cedar and coffee filled the air. Everywhere I looked, there were new projects pinned to the walls, honest, thoughtful designs that carried my name without apology. Vesper Quill had become a name people spoke with respect again. Jude Ashford stood beside me, his hand resting gently at the small of my back. He didn't say much, but the quiet pride in his eyes said everything. Next to him was our daughter Lyra, now 10 years old, wearing paint-splattered overalls and holding a small wooden model of a treehouse she had helped design. Her laughter echoed through the room as she showed visitors her latest creation. This was our home now, not just a workspace, a place where truth was allowed to grow. Elias Crow arrived quietly during the soft opening, dressed in his usual simple gray jacket. He didn't make a speech. He simply found me near the back wall, placed a hand on my shoulder, and smiled with the deep satisfaction of a teacher who had watched his student survive the fire. "You learned the hardest lesson, Vesper," he said softly. "Real justice isn't destroying the ones who hurt you. It's becoming someone they can never break again." His words settled warmly in my chest. Talia Reed and Lila Sterling had become more than allies. They were true partners now. Together, we had turned the quiet truth of what happened into something larger. Lila's platform carried stories of young women protecting their ideas, their voices, and their worth. Messages poured in daily from designers who refused to stay silent anymore. Talia handled the legal backbone with fierce precision, making sure no one else would have to rebuild from ashes the way I once did. Kairos Quill, on the other hand, had quietly disappeared from the spotlight. Most of his major contracts had evaporated after the Horizon Tower incident. The industry moved on, as it always does. I heard through distant channels that he was starting over, small projects, humble beginnings, learning what it meant to build without shortcuts. I didn't feel triumph when I thought of him, only a strange, tired kind of sadness for the boy who had once been so afraid of being replaced. Harlan and Lenore tried to reach out in small, careful ways. Handwritten letters arrived at the studio, tiny gifts addressed to Lyra, a children's book about family, a delicate silver bracelet. Each one carried the weight of unspoken regret. I read them alone at night, feeling the old ache rise and then slowly settle again. Eventually, I allowed one brief meeting. We met at a quiet park near the water on a cool Saturday morning. No long conversations about the past. No dramatic apologies in front of my daughter. I made that condition very clear. Lyra played on the swings while Harlan and Lenore sat on a bench, watching her with careful, hungry eyes. They spoke gently to her about simple things: school, her drawings, the weather. When it was time to leave, my mother hugged Lyra a little too tightly, tears shining in her eyes. But she kept her promise and said nothing more. I watched them walk away, two figures growing smaller against the gray Seattle sky, and felt something inside me finally loosen its grip. Not forgiveness exactly, just release. Later that same afternoon, as golden autumn light filtered through the studio windows, I sat on the wide bench with Lyra. She was curled against my side, carefully coloring the edges of a new floor plan. The room was quiet except for the soft scratch of her crayons. "Mom?" she asked suddenly, not looking up from her drawing. "Do I have grandparents? Like, your mom and dad?" The question landed gently, but it still carried weight. I looked down at her small hands, so full of innocent curiosity, and felt the familiar pull of old memories. The gala lights, my mother's proud clapping, my father's rare nod. The night everything was taken. The long years of silence. The slow, painful rebuilding. I brushed a strand of hair from her face and answered softly, "They're part of an old chapter, sweetheart. A chapter that hurt for a very long time." I paused, letting the words breathe. "But we're writing a new one now, one that belongs to us." Lyra thought about that for a moment, then nodded as if it made perfect sense to her 10-year-old heart. She went back to coloring, humming quietly to herself. I rested my chin on top of her head and closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and fresh paper. Outside, the city continued its gentle rhythm. Inside, my name, Vesper Quill, finally felt like it truly belonged to me again. Not because I had destroyed anyone, but because I had built something they could never touch. This is a story about revenge in its truest, quietest form. It's not about making others suffer. It's about living a life so full, so honest, and so brightly your own, that the people who once tried to erase you can no longer reach the light. And in the end, that is the only victory that truly lasts. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for riding with us today. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully, only to support production, while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.